What's up, Killing for Company? My name is Kellen, and today the return of Cut Your Teeth. So, for those who don't know, last summer I did a series chronicling the 2000s, essentially 2000 to 2010 was my period of focus for the series. And while I did touch on bands from Brazil within the 4 episodes, today I'm going to focus strictly on bands from Brazil. So, purely a Brazil Cut Your Teeth episode. As we get into it here, I just want to thank anyone who watched the series. If you haven't, you can go back and check. There's 4 episodes a while back that talk about the bands from that era, if you want to kind of get caught up to speed. But I'm going to start today providing a bit of context into my sort of thoughts into Brazilian death metal at the turn of the millennia, and also sort of let you know what you missed. So for those who did not see the series, bands that are part of this era of Brazilian death metal but won't be mentioned in today's episode, there obviously are a lot of bands to pick and choose from, but I'm just going to go through 5 here today, in addition here to the ones that I mentioned in the Cut Your Teeth series, which are Abhorrence, Vomepotro, and Absolute Disgrace. You can go, I provided links in those Cut Your Teeth videos if you want to check those bands out, but Brazilian death metal from the 2000s that are also worth your time. I'll let you watch those videos and kind of get caught up to speed if you were interested in adding to the list that I'm going to be throwing your way today. In the background, like I said, we're doing all Brazilian death metal. So this is from 2020, I believe. This is Venomous Breath, which is a newer death metal band from Brazil. Anyway, we got that playing in the background here to kind of keep with the theme of the episode. Let me turn it up for you. Perfect. So, to provide a bit of context for this video, before jumping into like any kind of analysis or my thoughts on bands from the country and the era, I think it's important to kind of, I pulled 2 albums aside that come around in 1995, and they're going to help sort of guide the narrative for this video. I think often, coming here from America, we look at a country like Brazil, and I think the too often end up basically our analysis or understanding of the contribution from Brazil to death metal ends up coming up short from what the country actually deserves in terms of their contribution and how influential they are. And to this episode's point, an incredibly small sort of lens in which to understand and interpret the bands. I cannot say, like, Sepultura is an incredibly important band from the 80s and 90s, but if I were to sort of press most death metal fans, what are the other death metal bands specifically that you know from the era from Brazil, it's difficult to get 2nd, 3rd, 4th tier in the same way that we would talk about American death metal bands or Swedish death metal bands at length, right? We can provide incredibly in-depth listings of bands from those countries, and even within that specific country, regional contributions. Brazil is an incredibly large country with hundreds of millions of people, so it's not like a small country with limited resources or access to music. I think we get comfortable looking at America or parts of Europe as being the central sort of guiding lens to which we understand the genre, and end up being satisfied with a very narrow window of opportunity or vision of what Brazil has to offer. So I pulled 2 records here to sort of demonstrate a crossroads within Brazilian death metal. So the one that you may know these are both from 1995. This is Christian's Black Horse Domain. Most people know this band, and for the era that I'm talking about here, probably the definitive Brazilian death metal band. They've been around now for almost 3 decades, and most people know them. With Century Media now, well established, right? So one band that you may not know, this is Strangulation. So Strangulation, this record here comes out in 1995. This is a compilation of their album Between Nothing and Eternity, and also in this 2017, I believe, reissue, this digipack, we get their demo tracks. So 1 through 11 corresponds with the album, and then 12 through 17 are the bonus tracks, part of a demo tape and Portal to Doomsday Celebration demo. So some demo tracks here. The reason I I wanted to grab these 2 was to demonstrate a point. Brazilian death metal in the 80s and 90s, I think it's fair to say, was still sort of a secondary or a part of the world that was picking up the genre and, coming to terms with how much freedom they had artistically to explore within it, what their contributions would be, what is the Brazilian sound, essentially, is still getting worked out. And Strangulation sounds incredibly, to talk about this band without talking about death, the legendary American death metal band, is a disservice, right? And what's really cool, so in this digipack release, you get like the initial sort of album artwork. Here's the band. You can see, rocking the death shirt there. On the back, here's a band photo, Benediction and Carcass. So very much part of that 90s, late 80s. But they sound very much like death. They're, I would call them like a progressive or technical death metal band, especially by comparison to something like Sepultura. And the influence is almost immediate, right? There's even a cover here of Spiritual Healing. So that they aren't hiding their influence in that regard. But this second part of the digipack is really cool. Basically, it chronicles all these different flyers in Brazil, many of which are in Portuguese, so I can't read them. These are fanzines that had, right, even though potentially they didn't have larger distribution, Strangulation did have, for die-hard death metal fans in the 90s, some kind of access, or did have some kind of inroads to broader distribution, even if it was a very small crowd. This was really cool is they also have all these, this is Metal Invaders and Roadie Crew. Both of these are in Portuguese, so I'm assuming these are metal magazines that are coming out in Brazil. Dynamite and Rock Brigade also looks to be in Portuguese, meaning inside of Brazil, it maybe wasn't that big outside of a very small group of people who were involved in the American or European death metal scene, but inside of Brazil, it was meaningful and meant something. And this is so cool to get a glimpse into what internally Brazilian death metal fans are experiencing and what kind of media they have access to. what death metal means to them, right? But it also, I think, should challenge our interpretation of Brazilian death metal as being secondary, right? That we have a more access at this point in time in history to look back at what Brazil had to offer as a country to death metal and its history. And it's a disservice to only name one or two bands without investigating further. Just to kind of cap off the death, here is, I can't obviously swear to this authentication, but we'll just say that this is real. It looks like a correspondence with Chuck Schuldiner that the band had, talking about the lead up to Symbolic. They may have sent Death a tape or some sort of sample of their album, but anyway, we get a band like Strangulation with that kind of background, and that's 1995. Here comes, as I drop everything, here comes Christian, right? I want to say this band now, people are critical of Christian to some degree. It's like all based on intensity and speed. There's not a lot of interesting songs. They're kind of boring. I think that is like the people who don't like the band, that's their criticism. But I do want to say there is sort of a transition in terms of a country being able to find its own voice within a genre, and how important this record was. Now, if you don't like that style, that's completely fine, right? If you were someone to say, I don't like the style of Swedish death metal, you're completely in your right to feel that way. But to deny that it has a role or impact outside of the country, or just, history should not take notice, I think is a major disservice. And so I wanted to use this record to serve as a sort of place to ground the rest of the analysis. So we shift from a brand like Strangulation that is so deeply entrenched in an American influence and transition to a band like Christian, which is starting to sort of make a new path for Brazil as a country, develop a sound to which others see as like foundational, to which they can sort of build off of going forward, letting go of the 80s and early 90s as we get closer to the 21st century, which is going to be sort of the focus for me personally. This Cut Your Teeth series is very much invested in that particular era. Okay, so that's my background. Take a drink here. So let's talk about the first record that I have for you today is by Hecatomb, and this is Empire of No Emperor. So this is a later reissue. Originally came out in 1999, so I may be kind of breaking my rule here about the year 2000, but close enough, right? The assignment is straightforward enough to where I think people will understand. First off, what is going on with this album artwork, right? I don't know what to tell you here, but it finds Brazilian death metal in kind of a state of transition. To me, this sounds, in between, where death metal was and where it's going. So it's nowhere near as intense as a Christian release or another band that I think probably deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as Christian, which is Rebellion. I have a Rebellion CD floating around here somewhere that I wanted to recommend for you. Yes, okay. So this is Burn the Promised Land. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think, like Christian, they're like the next band in line that people will know. But so these two records are sort of definitive in terms of establishing the sound for Brazilian death metal. But I did not want Rebellion to go unmentioned. But we don't want to spend time there because I'm going to get back to Hecatomb. So like I was saying, this is an album in transition. So they have instrumentals here that are kind of proggy. That album artwork doesn't look brutal by any means. It doesn't look satanic either. It definitely has these additional influences that would lead you to believe it is a more progressive death metal band from Brazil. Now, I don't want to go too far into this album artwork because for some reason they decided to, I don't know if they hired women to, anyway, I'll just leave it there. But some of the rest of the album artwork is pretty cool. And the last track is in 3 parts, 3 movements, if you want to call it that. So the saga, Act 1, the fall of Dreamers, Act 2, the quest, Act 3, the 3 outro. You know, you take something like that, it's a bit more ambitious in terms of songwriting. You throw in these instrumental passages, you put in the album artwork on top of that. It does not blast with the kind of relentless pacing that you would get from the bands like Christian or Rebellion. So in that sense, it's a little bit older in terms of its sound. It hasn't quite made that threshold or that jump, but at the same time, it offers some brutality. Interestingly enough, when you look them up on Metal Archives, and I think they're listed as brutal death metal, don't pay attention to that. This sounds closer to Strangulation than it does something like Christian or much less Internal Bleeding. So
walking on waves, I feel the tears face, no one stops, and the dogs are unmasked.
Now this one, I believe this is pronounced Nephaf. I'm gonna pull that out of the sleeve so you can take a look at it. There's no glare. Now, this is going to satisfy that Brazilian intensity, right, where it's just wind-swept, scorched earth death metal that I think the country at this point in time is really becoming known for. Abhorrence is a band that also fits into this category that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Now this is a bit more mid-paced, I have to say. The sort of leading edge quality, or the textural analysis, if you want to call it that, like it has the same kind of texture to the guitar where it's really dry, but you don't have the consistent blasting all song after song. There's a bit more sort of mid-paced groove at times, which I think for a lot of people, if you get tired of that intensity, is a nice sort of, gives you some breathing room, right? Or something to at least sink your teeth into. The people who might say this is like uninspired, like why do I need 4 bands in this style? But once again, I want to make this point is, I think if you were to A, B, or A, B, C, D, you know, put these bands back to back to back to back against one another, that they would sound different. Like you'd be able to make out more nuance between the bands if you were comparing them side by side, as opposed to sort of zooming out, looking at the entire scope of death metal on a global scale, and you know, hearing them in a mix. Like in that sense, like they share so much in common sonically with their countrymen that it may not stand out. But I think if you're, once again, looking internally inside of Brazil, right? Like one, you have a recognized and definitive sound that defines the country. or at least that you can announce to the world, like this is sort of the centerpiece to what we're known for at this point in time in history. And then you go to a show, you could probably point out the differences, right? Like if I were to sit down and listen to Abhorrence Rebellion and Christian and Nephath, it's the weird sort of combination of consonants here that have me a bit challenged. Then you would, anyway, if you were to listen to them all together, you'd be able to tell the differences. And I think that's just worth mentioning, right? Like it's important that we think about them as being different, right? Like you can listen to Incantation and Immolation and you would say, oh, they're kind of the same band. Anyone who's from that area and listens to that music, or much as the country, like there are clear differences between those two bands. And for someone who is, passingly listening to them, they may not stand out. But for more dedicated listeners to that specific style of death metal, or Morpheus Descends, for example, Rotrevor, like you will clearly be able to make out distinct differences. It just may take more time for people who are uninitiated to do so. So if anyone comes across and they're like, this is just another clone in that style, that would be my rebuttal or sort of pushback from a reflexive sort of criticism of them. Mentioned it, Immortal, Unholy, Triumph from 2001. Okay, this next record is the kind of album that makes me such a connoisseur of this generation. So this is In Torment, Diabolic Mutilation of Tormented Souls. And it comes around in 2006. It is for me and my preferences within death metal, this is dynamically and instrumentally challenging enough, but it doesn't sound like a giant pile of limp noodles, or it doesn't sound like, math homework. It's, yes, technical, brutal death metal. I mean, it's difficult for me to get around that, but once again, to drive this point home, I think it's important to look at a band like Christian as sort of being the foundation. Like, if you're growing from that base and pulling in Cannibal Corpse from this era, and pulling in Suffocation from this era, and pulling in other bands that I love circa 2000, the early aughts, like Sweden's Anata or Devos from Poland. Like, those bands, much like In Torment, hit a certain sweet spot for me that is still death metal enough to speak to the kind of aggression and weight and pure destructive force that as everybody loves about the genre, while at the same time, bringing in a level of technical flair and instrumentation that I like from this era, that brings me back to a time in my life when I'm in my early 20s, right? Which is in 2006, I'm at that point in my life. Like, I'm 21 going on 22 here, and I will never, that time period in my life is special, and these kind of records, I feel, it's right before, the technical death metal became so over the top that it turned into a lot of deathcore that I do no longer identify with it by any means. And it doesn't sound like the 90s death metal that to some degree really belongs, I think, on some kind of personal and emotional level to a generation prior to my own. So this perfect sweet spot. If you liked like the Anata Devos that I mentioned, this is another one. It's not quite as melodic as the Nada. It doesn't have the same kind of technicality that Devos has. It's Brazilian, right? Circa the 2000s. But you throw this up to a Rebellion record, this sounds way more technical. And that's not to say that Rebellion's they're not talented players. Is that this is a whole different sort of can of worms. So they put out a record in 2011 that I also really like. This is their first full length. The 2011 record shows a bit more. It's a better produced record, and I don't mean that in a negative way. There's just a greater weight to it. This is a little bit thinner, like the contrast between the guitars and the drums feel a bit divided, where the bass hasn't quite elevated itself in the mix here to sort of blend between the two. The guitars really have to drop off before you hear the bass in the mix. Or in the 2011 release, you can hear that over the 5 years, they've kind of noticed the shortcomings from the production here and stepped up their game. But for a debut full length in 2006, I absolutely can hang with this. And a great technical death metal record from the 2000s from Brazil. Check this one out. This is probably the one out of the group that I'm going to show here that really I really miss listening to on a consistent basis. I will pull out and be like, that is right in the sweet spot for me personally. So oh, by the way, I'm going to take photos once again like I usually do for these. Also, album artwork here. I can see if I can actually get the artist is credited. You know what I'll do to save time? I'll post it in the somewhere here in the video so you can check it out. Editing, post-production, I can do this. Okay. Moving on. Okay, so we have here, this is Ophiolatry. I think that's correct pronunciation. Ophiolatry? There we go. Ophiolatry. Which is I had to look this up, the worship of snakes. Or the deification of snakes, which is pretty cool. This band, has two full lengths. One came out in 2002 and is very much a pure satanic death metal release. They did a split, if you're looking for some kind of context there, they did a split in 2004 with Infernal Dominion. For those keeping score, that's a Texas death metal band that had one full length and shares members with the likes of Imprecation and so that's my little glimpse into, if you want to know how satanic they are or what kind of death metal they were playing with in that time period, Infernal Dominion is going to be your sort of cue. That record is awesome, and I have yet to find added to my collection. But this is totally different, and for the sake of kind of diversity for this episode of Cut Your Teeth, this to me sounds like almost a grind record, like the Berserker or Agoraphorik Nosebleed. Then there's programmed drums here as well as live drums. It's 16 tracks in less than 32 minutes. And yet it's kind of a technical death metal release. So if you had taken a Christian release and just condensed the songs to 2 minutes, you get a whole lot of that here. Now, the industrial or electronic components to this may turn off a lot of death metal fans who are a bit more, like the classic sound. But you think about what's also happening in the world, in death metal at this time. It's completely of the period, right? Of their era, and it sounds totally unlike the rest of the bands here. I wonder if they just kind of got bored of doing the traditional satanic death metal thing and wanted to try something. The instrumental chops involved in doing this and pulling this off are unbelievable. So if you like, that kind of technical death metal, it kind of extends beyond my comfort zone in time, yet it is completely novel. I forget there's a Lost Soul release that comes around, I think, in this time period. This is 2008. By the way, Transmutation is the name of the album. I'll throw a little screenshot of the Lost Soul release from 2009. But anyway, if you compare it, that's the one that keeps coming to my head because it just shows the kind of growth the band made within the course of a decade. Totally more, they don't sound, that Lost Soul record is far more ambitious in scope, right? It does like a cosmic theme to its ethos. This feels much more like the industrial side of it almost gives you a little bit of manic, like there's a psychosis involved within the listening of this, and it slips in and out of consciousness, right? There's these, like, almost you move from an orchestral, 30-second interlude to something that is electronic, and then back into a 2-minute just absolute blast, grind infused track. So it's cleaner and probably in terms of the production, and you probably have to go for that clean style in order to find the kind of separation in all the different sort of instruments that are going on here. If it was too muddy, sometimes you get like really fast songs, but when the production style is so muddied, you can't. It just sounds, there's no death metal to it as much as it is just noise. And they still wanted this to be a death metal release, so Ophiolatry, Transmutation, 2008. I want to cover here. I really want to throw this out though. If you like the more traditional death metal, go back to the 2002 release, or the split with Infernal Dominion. Those are going to be like, I think, it's something that I still want to add to my collection because I love that kind of death metal. But this is a completely different sort of glimpse into what the band had to offer towards the end of the aughts or 2010 decade. And out of the many bands, like if I had to choose between, I don't want to scare anyone off from pulling that aside and giving it a listen, but totally unique if you like a little bit more of electronic and industrial influences within your death metal. And once again, a different kind of sound coming out of Brazil, however rooted in something, had evolved and offered a different glimpse into what the country had to offer. So last up here, this is Inside Hatred. Now, I'm kind of, once again, I broke my rules with the hecatomb at the beginning. This comes around in 2012, but I wanted to pull this one aside. So this is called Salvation's Failure. And this band, I wanted to end here because here we get in 2012, the death metal world, you know, if you can remember, has started to shift, right? The sound that had defined the 2000s is starting to look deeper into the death metal catalog, or pantheon, if you will, for influence. And, you know, 2008, you know, we're looking, Theology comes out, but in the same year you get Dead Congregation. The same year you get Father Befouled. You get other, Necrovation is one from Sweden that you may not know, but I think comes out in 2008. But that resurgence of dark, heavy, you know, dredging death metal comes back and is huge, right? Labels like Dark Descent and Profound Lore sort of capitalize on that, and you can see where they are today. So Inside Hatred to me sounds like a band that wanted to make that turn, but within Brazil. So this is not nearly as punishing in terms of its pacing. It's not relentless. It doesn't necessarily peel the paint off the walls due to the velocity that it moves at. It's much more about a broader sense of atmosphere and a coloration to the sound that gets you immersed in the experience rather than the attack necessarily. But here's the band there. This is their, I believe, lone full length, and I don't know if they're still listed as active. I don't know where they are. But in closing, you know, talking about this band and sort of Brazilian death metal, as I've got Venomous Breath, you know, moving in the background here. There's a newer sort of generation of death metal coming out of Brazil, but you know, I look at the liner notes here and the influences for these bands. They're Brazilian for the most part. For example, like Escarnium is another Brazilian death metal band that is come around here in the last decade, and they're signed on Redefining Darkness, I believe. So you can see that like there's been a shift within the country that is trying to speak to like a modern sound, or you know, what most people are gravitating towards right now within death metal. But their influences don't need to venture out of Brazil. It has been a country that has contributed so much to the genre that I you know, by comparison to where we started today with Strangulation, right? Like, from a band that was very much tied to an American sort of sound, American defined Brazilian death metal band, right? No longer, and for a long time, decades now, Brazilian death metal has had its unique sort of contribution to the genre, and I think it's a disservice that we don't spend more time talking about Brazil. Now, while I will focus on this specific era, because here at Killing for Company, I think that's going to be a major focal point for this channel going forward. And we're going to get, I don't want to give too much away, but I want to extend that outside of just death metal, even though that is like my genre of choice from the era. You know, like I was talking about earlier, this is a time period in my life when I feel most, you know, incredibly connected, you know, from a personal, emotional vantage point to the genre. So you'll see more and more bands and sort of video content that chronicle the specific decade. You know, from something like Strangulation all the way here to in 2012 with Inside Hatred. If you know, I know there's a new Father Bethald release this year, and a style of death metal that is very much popular right now. Go ahead and check this out. You know, this comes around the same time period that something like Disma, for example, was really popular, I think in 2011. And you don't need to, you know, if that's worth your time, go check out Inside Hatred, band from Brazil that did not get the same kind of hype and recognition, and is very much the sound of today within death metal. So that's kind of my little piece here. Once again, I will put a link to all the Cut Your Teeth series probably in this, in the description below. If you watched any of those videos and took the time to comment, thank you very much. It meant a lot to me, and it got a lot of, you know, traction. So I want something I want to keep up for this channel. That's all I really got for you today. I've got some more Cut Your Teeth or 2000 death metal projects in the works here that I'll kind of those ideas I'll kind of keep close to my chest for now. But until then, I'll see you guys later. Bye.